I wanna hear the one about the big old plum tree. I wanna hear the one about the giggly bumblebee. I wanna hear the one about the juggly jumping flea. That's the story that I wanna hear. That's the story, that's the story, that's the story that I wanna hear. That's the story, that's the story, that's the story that I wanna hear.
Kia ora, I'm Ronnie. Welcome to another instalment of That's the Story. This week we have more stories, we have more songs, and what's more, we're going to meet a lot of people with some weird names. First of all, let's meet Mrs. N. Parker. I wonder what the N stands for.
Mrs. N. Parker was a mystery to everybody that lived in Waikawa Bay. It wasn't because she was in any way mysterious. Oh no, heaven forbid. Everybody knew Mrs. N. Parker's business. No, what sent the entire inhabitants of Waikawa Bay into a confused spin was what the N stood for in her name, Mrs. N. Parker. Does it stand for Nancy? Young Zach would ask her on his way to school. Don't be ridiculous. Nancy! Do you think my parents would have called me Nancy? Do you? And besides, I know what you were up to at the weekend, young Zach. I saw you pinching those oranges off Mrs. Stable's orange tree. Don't tell me it wasn't you. I saw you out my window. Penelope once thought she had a good plan. She spent a whole week trying her hardest to think of as many names as she could that started with N. Is that Naomi? No. Nellie? No. Natalie? No. Nairi? No. Nadia? No. But don't think I don't know what you were up to, Penelope. I saw you cut across the park on the way to school yesterday. That park has a keep off the grass sign, and I saw you on the grass. Mrs. O'Leary at the baker's shop couldn't help but having a go at guessing Mrs. N. Parker's first name. Could it be Nita? Mrs. N. Parker was aghast. Nita! Nita! Never! But I know what you do with your day-old bread. Oh, don't you worry, Mrs. O'Leary. I've seen you put the day-old bread in with the fresh bread. Don't think I don't see. I'm watching you, see? Always watching. And off she trotted, out of Mrs. O'Leary's bakery with an arm full of fresh bread. Mr. Gunter from just up the road. Morning, Mrs. Parker. It wouldn't be Nadia. And Mrs. N. Parker just humphed and walked on by without a word. Then stopped about 4 steps past Mr. Gunter from just up the road, turned on her heel, and while pointing her finger at poor old Mr. Gunter, got stuck in. I saw you, Mr. Gunter. I was watching over my fence, my next door neighbour's fence, while I was keeping an eye on her backyard. I looked over into your backyard and noticed it. You know you're not allowed to just build a shed. You need council permission for that, Mr. Gunter. Council permission, you hear? And off she trotted, nose in the air, sniffing around for more controversy, madness, mayhem and wrongdoings going on. Could it be Nadine? The local policeman had asked while strolling that Sunday. No, it's not, Mrs. N. Parker replied, snapping at the poor man. And I saw you, yes, I saw you. Right out my kitchen window I saw you. And a policeman as well. Shame on you taking that slice of cream pie from Mrs. Gabbers. The policeman turned red. But it was only a slice. And Mrs. N. Parker just humphed. I see everything, officer, everything. And on it went. Nikki? No. Nicola? No. Nio? No. Narnia? No. Not one single person in all of Waikawa Bay could get it. And to this day, no one knows the first name of Mrs. N. Parker. But by crikey, she knows everyone else's.
Now, the That's the Story YouTube channel is quite good. It's got some amazing cartoons there, some incredible stories, some outstanding songs, and some complete and utter silliness. That's the Story YouTube channel. Do subscribe now. In a few moments, we're going to be playing the game Who Am I? It's where I give you a whole lot of clues, and from those clues, you've got to try and guess who I am. That's coming up in a moment. First of all, let's have another story.
John met and fell in love with Ella. They got married. John's name was John Cousins. This meant that Ella and John became Mr. and Mrs. Cousins.
Oh.
However, they weren't cousins at all.
What?
They were husband and wife.
Hey?
Now, before Ella married Mr. John Cousins, she used to be a sister.
She was what?
Her maiden name had been Ella Sisters, and Ella came from a whole family of sisters. However, she didn't have any real sisters herself. Ella only had a brother, and his name was Morris, Mr. Morris Sisters.
Hang on.
One day, Morris met and fell in love with Millicent. They soon became Mr. and Mrs. Sisters and were the in-laws of Mr. and Mrs. Cousins.
Beg your pardon?
But Morris and Ella weren't sisters or even cousins. They were siblings, and as for Millicent and Morris, they weren't remotely sisters. They were, like John and Ella before them, purely and simply husband and wife. Now, Millicent's sisters had come from a family of men. That is to say that prior to marrying Mr. Morris' sisters, Millicent was known as Millicent Man, and her family were all mans. And, apart from her father, there wasn't a man among them.
And they were...
Yes, Millicent's sisters, Nee Man, had 7 sisters all of her very own, and not one single one of them was a man.
No.
Millicent's sisters, Nee Man's father, was a father.
Really?
That is to say, he was a father in the church and was known lovingly by his congregation as Father Man. Father Man proudly gave away Millicent Man and also conducted the nuptial service. So Father Man was not only father of the bride, but he was the father of the church too, and willingly gave away his daughter to become Millicent's sisters, despite the fact that she already had 7 sisters all of her very own, and so far all of them except Millicent remained men. Now, before too long, John and Ella Cousins began to make children of their own. They had Sarah and Toby Cousins, who of course weren't cousins at all, but were brother and sister. Not to be outdone, the in-laws of John and Ella soon started producing offspring of their own, and these children were cousins, although their surname was Sisters, but they weren't sisters at all because they were both boys. Father Man was very proud of his young grandsons, Rudolph and Samuel Sisters, and hanging out at their house, he soon got to know their cousins, Sarah and Toby Cousins, although they themselves weren't cousins at all, but siblings, just like Ella and Morris.
You what?
Now, you may have thought that all these cousins, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives and fathers would be confusing for the extended family of cousins, sisters and men.
No.
But the family didn't find it difficult at all.
Really?
They relished in the fact that they had cousins who weren't cousins, but marital spouses, sisters that weren't sisters at all, but simply married to each other, other sisters that were men, although there wasn't a man among them, and fathers who were fathers, not once but twice, but so far never grandfathers, and the extended families of cousins, sisters, and the proud name Man had extra special fun at Christmas time when they had to give out all their presents.
I beg your pardon? Now, who am I? It's a pretty simple game. We give you a whole heap of clues, and from those clues, based on those clues, you've got to try and guess who it is we're talking about. There's lots of clues. If you study them carefully, you will find out who it is we're talking about. You're allowed to use Google. You can work in teams, work in a pair, just work. Have a very careful listen. Here come those clues. Thinking caps on.
What's his name? What's she called? I think I know who that is. Who could it be? Let's wait and see what the clues are to this quiz.
On August the 14th in the year 2000, this person premiered on Nickelodeon and instantly ranked as the #1 rated preschool show on commercial television. She was the first Nickelodeon preschool character to appear online prior to making her on-air debut on August the 14th, 2000. The first Spanish word taught on her show was azul, which means blue. Her show is broadcast all over the world, syndicated to TV broadcasters in 151 markets and translated into 30 languages. She teaches Spanish in the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Ireland, but teaches English in every other market around the world. The inspiration for her name was exploradora, the Spanish feminine word for explorer, and the acclaimed writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Approximately 300 people work on her show, and it takes over a year to produce a single episode of the show. She has been honoured with awards including the Peabody, NAACP, Alma, Imogen, Latino Spirit, Gracie Allen, Parents' Choice Award, the Television Critics Association Award, and 16 Daytime Emmy nominations.
What's his name? What's she called? I think I know who that is.
Any ideas? Any clues? Any thoughts? Get your thinking caps on. Perhaps use Google. I hope you took notes. Now, let's hear a story about a particular knitting group. A rather interesting knitting group. Mrs. Gribblestock was the president of the Amberley Knitting Group, second only in size to the Dunsandel Group, and they was second only in size to the Twizel Group. So, as you can imagine, Mrs. Gribblestock was president of quite a large knitting group indeed. They met at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. Don't ask me what 11s are. Only people like Mrs. Gribblestock and her troop of mad knitters, I say mad, more like crazed, know the answer to that question. Once those knitting needles started, there was no stopping the Amberley Knitting Group. They once knitted a nice blanket. Not very unusual, one would have thought. Only, it was a blanket for the United States of America. The Americans were having a particularly cold winter that year, so Mrs. Gribblestock and her knitting friends knitted the blanket big enough to cover the whole country. They once helped NASA out. The space shuttle lost its heat shield, so couldn't re-enter Earth's atmosphere without burning up and killing everyone on board. Well, Mrs. Gribblestock and her knitting Nellies couldn't. Nay, they wouldn't have any of this, so they got to work and jolly well knitted a nice cool cover for the space shuttle. A second space shuttle was sent up into space. The knitted cover was placed snugly over the distressed space shuttle and it landed safely without incident. Gosh, that was an exciting time for the Amberley Knitting Group. They were a nice bunch of little old ladies, and one little old man, Mr. Cripulus from Kaikoura. Mr. Cripulus was indeed from Kaikoura and was a kind man with the longest fingers you ever did see. Perfect for knitting. Yes, a nice bunch of people with just one itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny foible, one little niggle. It was just that they, well, didn't like aliens. Now, don't go thinking they had any prejudices here. The Amberley Knitting Group was open to all people of all races from all countries, but aliens, by crikey, this was a tricky, sticky situation to be in. It wasn't because they were from another planet or anything. It wasn't because of their big googly-boogly eyes they sometimes had. It wasn't because of their strange luminous green colour, although their colour could clash with some of the shades of wool they had. No, what Mrs. Gribblestock and her knitting nanas didn't like about aliens was, well, their excess of arms. The aliens that Mrs. Gribblestock and the Amberley Knitting Group had come across had a whole bunch of them, 4 arms each. Way too many for any being really, but there you go. No, there was no pattern on planet Earth that catered for a jumper that had 4 arms. And the knitting group was beside themselves trying to step up to the challenge. They knitted. Oh, yes, they knitted all right. There was no way this alien was going to beat them.
Right, ladies, 4 arms it is.
It was always around now that Mr. Cripulus from Kaikoura would pipe up and say, "And man?" And Mrs. Gribblestock would answer,
Pardon? What? Come again?
and poor old Mr. Cripulus would stand,
You said right, ladies. I'm a man.
and he would sit down and Mrs. Gribblestock would continue,
Very good, Mr. Cripulus. So you are. Well done. Now, where was I?
and on they knitted. Through the night they knitted, right past 11sies they knitted right through Coronation Street and the Antiques Roadshow. They knitted furiously, but finally the 4-armed jumper was knitted, and it was indeed perfect. Quite perfect. In fact, the finest 4-armed jumper on planet Earth, if not, in fact, the only 4-armed jumper on planet Earth. Grooch Lord, the 4-armed alien, paid the knitting group for his new jumper and flew off impossibly in his super shiny spaceship. Now, it could have ended there, and the Amberley Knitting Group may have never developed a disliking for aliens, but the very next Tuesday at around about 11sies, there was a knock on the door of Mrs. Gribblestock's house.
Right in the middle of a meeting? Who could that be?
Upon opening the door, she found several hundred
four-armed aliens, all wanting the same jumper as their friend Grooch They got those jumpers knitted. Eventually. But they never really grew fond of aliens after that. In fact, they were inclined not to answer the door if the person or thing knocking had more than two arms.
7% of American adults believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows.
Billy goats urinate their own heads to smell more attractive to females. During your lifetime, you will create enough saliva to fill 2 swimming pools.
On the banks of the lake called Wanaka, there was a lovely old man who lived alone in a cottage right on the water's edge. He meant to build his little cottage into something quite grand, but always got a little sidetracked and, well, something else would come along and he would forget what it was that he was supposed to be doing in the first place. His name? Mr. Distraction. Mr. Distraction was easily distracted. While brushing his teeth of a morning, he would end up digging the garden. Now, how does one go from brushing one's teeth to digging the garden? Simple. Mr. Distraction had put the toothpaste on his toothbrush, and just as he was about to start brushing, his doorbell went. So off went Mr. Distraction to answer the door. Mr. Distraction answered the door to a lovely young man from the courier company. Mr. Distraction had a parcel from Dunsandel. Who do I know in Dunsandel? Mr. Distraction thought to himself. And after signing for the parcel, he went inside and took out his copy of the Dunsandel phone book to look up the name Douglas Tooth from Dunsandel. Well, Mr. Distraction looked through the Tamas, the Tettlers, the Tims, Tyndalls and Togalatellis. And there it was. Teeth. Now, Mr. Distraction was looking for a Douglas Tooth, but the small ad in the white pages for teeth got him thinking. I must get my tooth looked at. It does hurt a little, so he rang his dentist and made an appointment. His dentist told him if he brushed more often, this kind of thing wouldn't happen, and gave his teeth a polish and told him to floss more often. Floss? Mr. Distraction thought to himself. Floss? He thought again. I forgot floss. He ran back home and found Floss looking a little worse for wear. Floss was his favourite rosebush, and he was in the middle of moving her from one side of his garden to the other when the phone rang. Mr. Distraction was distracted again, but not this time. Oh no, Floss would be replanted. So off Mr. Distraction went and dug up the garden, put in some sheep pellets and fertiliser and planted Floss, his prize rose, right bang smack in the middle of his backyard. Now, thought Mr. Distraction, what was I doing? He never did find out what was in the package from Douglas Tooth of Dunsandel, but he did remember to floss more often.
Now, this week's show has had a bit of a theme. Have you guessed what that theme was? Perhaps our last song might actually give you a bit of a clue.
I'm a fly, and I don't know why I'm called a fly. 'Cause I walk. I'm not a walk, I'm a fly that walks. I'm a fly, and I don't know why. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. I'm a sea anemone, but I'm quite friendly. I could never be an enemy. I'm not an enemy, well actually I am a sea anemone. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. I'm a bat, and I don't like balls. I'm a bat that doesn't like games. I fly at night, I've got poor sight. I'm a bat, it's quite a silly name. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. I'm a calf with a laugh, I'm a four-legged calf, not a part of a person's leg. I'm a baby cow, so I don't see how a calf can be a part of your leg. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. I'm a cricket, a jumping, flying cricket. I am not a game. I've never hit a six or got me any hat tricks. We are not the same. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is. It's a name, just a silly name. It's a name, that's all it is.
I'm a fly, and I don't know why I'm called a fly, 'cause I walk. I'm not a walk, I'm a fly that walks. I'm a fly and I don't know why.
That's my lot for another week. Thanks ever so much for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe to the That's the Story YouTube channel. See you later.
That's the story that I wanna